Melania Trump made a subtle dig on a hot mic, but Jasmine Crockett's one-line comeback didn't just silence the room, it sparked a national reckoning. The hall smelled faintly of roses and old money. The grand ballroom at the Omni in downtown Dallas had never looked this polished, crystal chandeliers glinting off every polished surface, tuxedos brushing past designer gowns, heels clicking with quiet authority across marble. It wasn't just a fundraiser, it was a political theater dressed as a celebration. It was a Thursday evening in May, the kind where the Texas air still clung to your clothes even after sundown. The event had been billed as an Evening of American Grace, hosted by the Lone Star Heritage Committee, a Republican donor group with deep pockets and deeper opinions. The crowd? A curated mix of party insiders, megachurch pastors, oil heirs, and state legislators, all sipping champagne and scanning the room for who was talking to who. At the center of it all stood Melania Trump, still First Lady, still commanding the kind of attention that came not from what she said, but what she didn't. Her presence was deliberate. She didn't often make these appearances, especially alone. But tonight, she'd arrived without the former president, dressed in a sharply tailored white suit with gold buttons, her expression cool and unreadable. She drifted from group to group, never lingering too long. When she spoke, it was measured and brief. The camera crews stationed near the far wall were careful to keep their lenses on her whenever possible. This wasn't just a fundraiser, it was image management. About 20 minutes after her arrival, the buzz shifted. A staffer whispered something to someone at a table near the stage. Phones lit up. Heads turned toward the double doors at the side of the ballroom. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had just walked in. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Jasmine wore a two-piece power suit, burnt orange with intricate embroidery stitched along the lapel and sleeve cuffs, a nod to her Texas roots. Her hair was pinned up, her earrings bold, her heels unapologetically loud on the marble floor. She wasn't blending in, and she wasn't trying to. Some people clapped. Others just stared. One woman in pearls elbowed her husband and whispered something that made him smirk. Jasmine noticed, but she didn't flinch. She made her way to the check-in table, greeted two volunteers by name, and accepted a small envelope marked Speaker. Not everyone in that room liked her politics, but even her critics knew she knew how to hold space. Just behind the stage curtain, a camera crew prepped for a live stream. A sound technician adjusted the backup mic on the podium. In a side room, caterers fanned themselves while loading trays of Texas quail and bourbon pecan bites. Backstage, two staffers from the Lone Star Committee were ushering Melania into a private area for pre-event remarks. That's where the moment happened. A donor had complimented Melania's outfit, something about how crisp it looked. Then someone, maybe a board member, half-jokingly pointed out Crockett's outfit as colorful. Melania didn't laugh. She tilted her head slightly, smiled just enough, and said clearly, "Some people dress for the cameras, not the country." There was a pause. Not awkward, just still. Someone chuckled, unsure. Melania sipped her water and moved on, but the comment had landed, and someone nearby, maybe a junior staffer, maybe a tech, still had their mic feed hot. The audio was caught, not just by one recorder, but two. And within minutes, a whisper passed like static through the back of the ballroom. But Jasmine hadn't even reached the side stage yet. Back in the control room, two young AV techs were hunched over a soundboard. One was adjusting the mic levels, while the other monitored the live audio stream for the ballroom. When the mics picked up Melania's voice, they didn't think much of it at first, but then the words sharpened. Some people dress for the cameras, not the country. They froze. It wasn't just a casual aside. It was polished, deliberate, with just enough frost in the tone to bite without sounding angry. One tech glanced at the other, then immediately started clipping the audio. "Did you hear that?" he muttered. The other nodded, already dragging the file to a private folder on his laptop. They both knew what they had, and they weren't the only ones. Another mic, one planted discreetly near the podium for backup, caught the same thing. The feed was looped into a small laptop backstage where a communications volunteer named DeAndre was prepping talking points for the speakers. He heard it. He blinked twice, hit rewind, and played it again. He grabbed his phone and messaged Jasmine's aide. Text thread, 7:41 p.m. DeAndre, yo, you need to hear this right now. Alicia, Crockett's aide. DeAndre, Melania just said something wild about Jazz. Alicia, you sure? DeAndre, some PPL dress for the cameras, not the country. DeAndre, she said that. Mike was live. Alicia, oh hell. DeAndre, got the file. Sending now. The clip was short, 7 seconds, but those 7 seconds had weight. Alicia was standing near the refreshments table, sipping ginger ale and half listening to a state senator retell a story she'd already heard 3 times. When she got the text, she stepped away and played the audio through one AirPod. Her eyes went wide. She knew Jasmine would want to hear it before going on stage. Alicia made her way to the green room. Jasmine was seated, heels off, flipping through her speech notes and eating a few almonds from a Ziploc bag. Hey, Jazz. Jasmine looked up. Alicia held up her phone. Just listen. The congresswoman leaned in, listened, then listened again. She said nothing for a long beat. Her brow furrowed slightly, but her expression stayed calm. Jasmine leaned back in the chair and exhaled through her nose. Well, she said, isn't that something? Alicia looked at her, waiting for a cue. You want me to prep a response? We can adjust your opening lines. But Jasmine shook her head slowly. Nah, I got it. She stood up, slipped her heels back on, and tucked her notes under her arm. She glanced once in the mirror, adjusting her jacket ever so slightly. I ain't gonna get loud, she said, but I am gonna be clear. Meanwhile, in the ballroom, people were still talking, still smiling, but the undercurrent had shifted. One journalist, seated near the front, had already heard the clip. He whispered it to his colleague, who texted it to a producer in Los Angeles. The dominoes were falling in real time. On stage, the MC, a local businessman known more for his cattle than his charisma, wrapped up a slow-moving introduction. And now, please welcome to the stage, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Applause rippled, some enthusiastic, some polite, a few scattered half-claps. Jasmine emerged from the side curtain like she owned the carpet beneath her feet. The orange suit caught the stage lights just right, vibrant without being loud, assertive without shouting. She didn't look rattled. She looked ready. The podium mic was live. Jasmine didn't glance at her notes right away. Instead, she scanned the room for a second, then smiled. Not sweetly, not bitterly, just enough to let people know she saw everything. Before we talk policy, she began, I just want to say this. The room quieted. Phones went still. But what Jasmine said next would silence far more than just the ballroom. Back in the control room, 2 young AV techs were hunched over a soundboard. One was adjusting the mic levels, while the other monitored the live audio stream for the ballroom. When the mics picked up Melania's voice, they didn't think much of it at first. But then, the words sharpened. Some people dress for the cameras, not the country. They froze. It wasn't just a casual aside. It was polished, deliberate, with just enough frost in the tone to bite without sounding angry. One tech glanced at the other, then immediately started clipping the audio. Did you hear that? He muttered. The other nodded, already dragging the file to a private folder on his laptop. They both knew what they had, and they weren't the only ones. Another mic, one planted discreetly near the podium for backup, caught the same thing. The feed was looped into a small laptop backstage where a communications volunteer named DeAndre was prepping talking points for the speakers. He heard it. He blinked twice, hit rewind, and played it again. He grabbed his phone and messaged Jasmine's aide. Text thread, 7:41 p.m. DeAndre, yo, you need to hear this right now. Alicia, Crockett's aide. DeAndre, Melania just said something wild about Jazz. Alicia, you sure? DeAndre, some PPL dress for the cameras, not the country. DeAndre, she said that. Mike was live. Alicia, oh hell. DeAndre, got the file. Sending now. The clip was short, 7 seconds, but those 7 seconds had weight. Alicia was standing near the refreshments table, sipping ginger ale and half listening to a state senator retell a story she'd already heard 3 times. When she got the text, she stepped away and played the audio through one AirPod. Her eyes went wide. She knew Jasmine would want to hear it before going on stage. Alicia made her way to the green room. Jasmine was seated, heels off, flipping through her speech notes and eating a few almonds from a Ziploc bag. Hey, Jazz. Jasmine looked up. Alicia held up her phone. Just listen. The congresswoman leaned in, listened, then listened again. She said nothing for a long beat. Her brow furrowed slightly, but her expression stayed calm. Jasmine leaned back in the chair and exhaled through her nose. "Well," she said, "isn't that something?" Alicia looked at her, waiting for a cue. "You want me to prep a response? We can adjust your opening lines." But Jasmine shook her head slowly. "Nah, I got it." She stood up, slipped her heels back on, and tucked her notes under her arm. She glanced once in the mirror, adjusting her jacket ever so slightly. "I ain't gonna get loud," she said, "but I am gonna be clear." Meanwhile, in the ballroom, people were still talking, still smiling, but the undercurrent had shifted. One journalist, seated near the front, had already heard the clip. He whispered it to his colleague, who texted it to a producer in Los Angeles. The dominoes were falling in real time. On stage, the MC, a local businessman known more for his cattle than his charisma, wrapped up a slow-moving introduction. "And now, please welcome to the stage, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." Applause rippled, some enthusiastic, some polite, a few scattered half-claps. Jasmine emerged from the side curtain like she owned the carpet beneath her feet. The orange suit caught the stage lights just right, vibrant without being loud, assertive without shouting. She didn't look rattled. She looked ready. The podium mic was live. Jasmine didn't glance at her notes right away. Instead, she scanned the room for a second, then smiled. Not sweetly, not bitterly, just enough to let people know she saw everything. "Before we talk policy," she began, "I just want to say this." The room quieted. Phones went still. But what Jasmine said next would silence far more than just the ballroom. By the time Jasmine hit her second policy point, federal infrastructure block grants, social media had already lit up like a string of fireworks. A junior producer from KDFW, the local Fox affiliate, had been in the audience, streaming the event to his private Instagram just for his friends. But the moment Jasmine delivered that one-liner, "When you've never had to fight for anything," his DMs exploded. Within minutes, someone clipped the soundbite and tweeted it with the caption, "Crockett just ethered the First Lady on stage at a fundraiser in Texas." That tweet went viral in under 20 minutes. But inside the ballroom, Jasmine kept talking, focused, composed, her voice even. She walked the crowd through her agenda without missing a beat, her tone weaving between conversational and firm. She brought up small businesses struggling with inflation, healthcare deserts in rural Texas, broadband gaps that had turned classrooms into guesswork. She never returned to Melania, not even with a glance, but the crowd was still sitting with what she'd said. 3 tables back, a lobbyist leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Did she really just say that to Melania?" His wife shrugged. "She said it near Melania. That's even worse." At the front of the room, Melania remained silent. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Just that same unreadable expression, the kind you wear when you don't want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing you react. But something behind her eyes had changed. She wasn't used to being addressed directly, and certainly not like that. Outside the ballroom, 2 reporters had left their seats to phone in early pieces. The clip was already being passed between group chats and newsrooms across the country. By the time Jasmine finished her speech with a call for real service over stagecraft, reporters were fighting for position near the exit, hoping for a quote. But Jasmine didn't stop. She walked off the stage, past the curtain, and straight into Alicia's arms. Alicia grinned, handing her a fresh bottle of water. "They're going to talk about this one all year." Jasmine cracked a soft smile. "Let 'em. I meant every word." Meanwhile, cable networks had already picked up the clip. MSNBC played it just before commercial break with a chyron that read, "Congresswoman Crockett delivers quiet storm at Dallas fundraiser." CNN ran a full segment within the hour, framing it as a generational and ideological clash between 2 women who represented vastly different kinds of power. Even online forums that normally ignored political speeches were weighing in. On Reddit, someone wrote, "That line was cleaner than anything I've heard in a debate in 5 years." On TikTok, users edited the soundbite over slow-motion clips of Jasmine walking on stage, set to everything from Kendrick Lamar to Nina Simone. It wasn't just a moment. It was a signal. In a downtown Dallas hotel room, campaign strategist Travis LeClaire, working for a prominent Senate hopeful, stood in front of a whiteboard covered in polling numbers. He paused mid-sentence when his assistant showed him the clip. He watched it twice. Then he muttered, She just changed the conversation. Across town, a retired schoolteacher named Celeste Boyd was washing dishes when her niece sent her the video. Celeste stopped everything, played it on full volume, then called 3 friends. "I don't know who that girl is," she said, "but she just said what I've been feeling for 20 years. Not everyone was impressed, of course. Conservative commentators jumped into the fray, accusing Jasmine of being disrespectful, divisive, and aggressively performative. A few anchors attempted to soften the original Melania quote, framing it as a general remark about modern political fashion. But the original audio was clear, and context didn't do it any favors. Still, Jasmine didn't release a statement. She didn't tweet. She didn't repost the clip or do a victory lap. That silence, too, said something. She'd said what she said. That was the statement. Her calm wasn't performative. It was intentional. But silence doesn't stop speculation. It fuels it. And by morning, the moment had evolved into something much bigger than a 7-second exchange. By sunrise, it was no longer just political media dissecting the moment. It was breakfast television, radio hosts, group chats, and Facebook aunties reposting the clip with captions like, "Say it again, louder." At 6:43 a.m., Jasmine Crockett was the #1 trending topic on Twitter in the US. By 8:15, it was trending globally. The original 7-second soundbite now lived in hundreds of videos, memes, and edits. But what kept people talking wasn't just the comeback, it was the way she delivered it. Calm, steady, not smug, just right on time. Over at Good Morning Arizona, a panel of local anchors replayed the clip while sipping coffee and visibly holding back smirks. One of them, a former news anchor named Lorraine Vickers, finally said she knew exactly what she was doing. And it wasn't just about Melania. It was about the system that lets people like Melania say things like that and never get checked. Her co-host added, "And Jasmine didn't yell, she didn't call names, she didn't make it ugly, she just spoke from where she's been." At the same time, conservative radio in Oklahoma had taken a different approach. A host named Daryl Prescott opened his morning segment by calling the moment an unnecessary public jab at the First Lady, before suggesting Crockett had staged the whole thing. He speculated that Jasmine had wanted Melania to say something petty so she could look like a hero. That theory didn't stick, because as more footage leaked from multiple angles, it was clear. Jasmine hadn't even flinched when she walked in. She hadn't said a word until she was at the mic. There was no setup. There was just a reaction, and that made it land harder. At a coffee shop in Tulsa, a group of black women sat at their usual table by the window. One of them, Lorraine Wiggins, a retired nurse, was already talking about it when her friend Denise walked in. "Girl, she said it clean," Lorraine laughed, tapping her phone screen. "She didn't even raise her voice." "She didn't need to," Denise said. "That's what makes it sting." At a firehouse in Plano, 3 firefighters were watching the clip on someone's phone between calls. One of them shrugged. "I don't care who you vote for, man. That was cold. You can't even be mad at that." In D.C., aides for multiple Congress members were emailing summaries of the situation to their reps. Some Democrats saw an opportunity for messaging. Others quietly braced themselves, not wanting to get dragged into a press cycle that had nothing to do with them. Meanwhile, in a suite back in Dallas, Melania's press team was already working through their 4th draft of a statement. But the First Lady hadn't approved any of them. She was sitting near the window, arms crossed, scrolling through her phone in silence. An advisor approached. "We can either ignore it or reframe it. I suggest the latter." Melania didn't look up. "She said I never had to fight," she said quietly. "But she doesn't know anything about my life." The advisor hesitated. "You want to speak on it?" Melania finally looked away from the screen. Not yet. Her restraint surprised the team. Some had expected her to post something soft but firm, maybe a quote about grace or a nod to being misunderstood. But she stayed off social media, and that, in itself, created new speculation. Pundits filled the airwaves with questions. Was the First Lady shaken? Did Jasmine touch a nerve? Why didn't Melania fire back? Even late-night shows joined the chatter. One comedian opened with, "When Jasmine Crockett entered the chat, Melania Trump suddenly remembered how to log off." The room laughed. The clip played behind them again. Some said Jasmine had gone too far. Others argued that she hadn't gone far enough. But the most honest reactions came from people who recognized the moment not as drama, but as real. One black professor at Southern Methodist University put it best during an NPR call-in interview that afternoon. This wasn't about fashion. It wasn't even about politics. It was about proximity to struggle. And when someone who's had to climb says something to someone who's always been carried, it lands differently. But while the public debated tone, intention, and respectability, the truth was this. Both women had spoken without raising their voices, and now the country was straining to hear what would come next. That weekend, the fundraising gala was still making headlines, though not for its agenda, nor its $1 million donation tally. Everything was buried under the weight of one moment, one sentence, one silent reaction. And now, the consequences were starting to stretch beyond the ballroom. On Saturday morning, a conservative think tank out of Fort Worth released a brief statement calling Jasmine's comments deeply disrespectful to the office of the First Lady. It wasn't aggressive, but it was enough to signal that party lines were drawing tighter. That same afternoon, a Texas senator appeared on local news saying Crockett should apologize for personal attacks and remember she's there to represent the people, not clap back for social media points. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't hold another press conference. No interviews. Her phone stayed on silent, and she declined all weekend media requests. Instead, she returned to her district and visited a community clinic on the edge of Grand Prairie. Cameras showed up anyway. A reporter tried to ask about the gala. Jasmine turned toward her, smiled politely, and said, "I already spoke." That line made its way into headlines too. Meanwhile, Melania's camp still hadn't issued an official response. Days passed. Political commentators began speculating that maybe there wouldn't be one. A few insiders said privately that Melania was above petty fights. But even those quotes felt thin. Something was clearly brewing behind the silence. Then, on Monday morning, the Dallas Tribune ran a feature titled "Elegance, Grit, and the Politics of Appearance." The piece was long, thoughtful, and it didn't take sides. Instead, it traced decades of scrutiny over how women, especially women in politics, get judged, dressed, dismissed, or dismissed because of how they're dressed. And right in the middle of it, the article quoted Melania's original comment, without edits, "Some people dress for the cameras, not the country," followed immediately by Jasmine's reply. It was the first time both quotes had appeared in full, side-by-side in a national publication. The effect? Immediate. Editorial boards started chiming in. Professors wrote op-eds. High school debate teams used the exchange as a case study. A women's leadership summit in Philadelphia even built an entire panel around respectability politics and the cost of composure. Back at the White House, advisors debated whether Melania should address the quote during her next public appearance. But she declined. No written statement, no press briefing, just a carefully timed charity visit in Reno where she smiled for photos with children and said nothing about Dallas. But silence can say plenty, especially when you're used to being the one who defines the conversation. In the halls of Congress, the tension carried over. A senior GOP staffer, overheard in the cafeteria, joked that Jasmine had spooked half the office into checking their emails twice. The remark got laughs, but also earned a quick side glance from a colleague who replied, "Well, she's not wrong." Privately, Jasmine received messages from both sides of the aisle. Some were simple, "Well done." Others were more complicated, quiet thanks from women who'd never spoken up when they were talked down to, or subtle nods from men who understood that the world had tilted a bit that night. Alicia, her aide, read one message aloud in the office late one afternoon. It came from a veteran congresswoman who'd served for decades without ever once going viral. The message said, "You didn't disrespect anyone. You reminded them we're not furniture." Jasmine read it twice, then quietly filed it away, but not everyone was impressed. That same day, a PAC based in southern Florida released an ad painting Jasmine as angry, ungrateful, and a dangerous face of today's Democratic Party. The footage was grainy, pulled from old town halls, edited to make her look combative. The ad aired in select swing counties and was quickly condemned by several groups for its racial overtones. Still, the intention was clear: neutralize her before the moment grew legs. The problem was, it already had. A poll released by a nonpartisan group later that week found that 64% of respondents had seen or heard about the moment at the gala. Of those, a majority said they found Jasmine's response appropriate, measured, and truthful. Among younger voters, the number was even higher. And in barbershops, on podcasts, in classrooms, and at kitchen tables, people were still talking. But not just about the moment. They were talking about what led up to it and what it revealed about the gap between presence and power. By week's end, it was no longer about Melania versus Jasmine. It had grown into something else, something raw, complicated, and deeply familiar to a lot of Americans who didn't see themselves represented on stage very often. In a church basement on the south side of Fort Worth, a women's group was holding its regular Thursday evening meeting. It wasn't political by design, mostly retired teachers, single moms, and working professionals gathering to talk about life, family, and the occasional headline. But that night, the first words after the prayer were, "Did y'all hear what Jasmine said to the First Lady?" A younger woman named Brianna nodded slowly. It wasn't even disrespectful. It was just true. That's what got them mad. An older member of the group, Miss Thelma, folded her arms and replied, "Because truth hits different when it's said out loud by someone who's not supposed to say it." The women in the room hummed their agreement. This wasn't about disrespect. It was about hierarchy, about who's allowed to speak plainly, who has to dress like they're auditioning for acceptance, who gets labeled bold, and who gets labeled angry. That same week, over in Flagstaff, Arizona, a high school civics class had paused its normal lesson plan to talk about the event. Their teacher, Mr. Warren, wrote 2 quotes on the whiteboard, one from Melania, one from Jasmine. Then he simply asked, "What do you notice?" One student raised her hand. "It's like they're speaking different languages, but about the same thing." Another added, "Melania's talking at somebody. Jasmine's talking for people." The room nodded. News segments started inviting voices that didn't usually get airtime. Historians, sociologists, fashion experts, and even etiquette coaches. One professor from Louisiana State explained on air, "This isn't just a political moment. It's about how we measure credibility. Melania comes from a world where silence and appearance are power. Jasmine comes from a world where silence gets you erased." The public wasn't just listening. They were reflecting. Men, too, began weighing in. At a barbershop in Albuquerque, a father explained to his teenage son what he admired about Jasmine's response. "She didn't get loud. She didn't backpedal. She said it clear, like she was saying it to every daughter who ever got talked down to because she wore the wrong thing." The son nodded quietly. "Yeah, that's leadership, though." On college campuses, students began using the exchange as a jumping-off point to discuss representation, how we show up in rooms, who gets to wear what, and what it all means. A professor at Xavier University assigned an essay titled, "What is Presidential?" She asked her students to examine who defines professionalism, who it excludes, and whether dressing for the country meant erasing culture or elevating it. And in a surprising twist, a former First Lady, Laura Bush, was asked about the incident during a book signing in Dallas. She didn't take a side, but she said softly, "I think every woman in politics eventually gets judged for something that has nothing to do with her record." It wasn't a rebuke, but it wasn't a defense either. Just a small acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, we ask women in public life to jump through different hoops and wear the right shoes while doing it. But even as thoughtful conversations bloomed, the backlash still lingered. Certain outlets kept running segments that tried to paint Jasmine as combative, too confident, even arrogant. They pulled out old photos, dissected her tone, questioned her intentions. She didn't respond. Instead, she posted a picture of her district office reopening after minor renovations. The caption? "Back to work. Simple. Direct." Another statement without speaking. In doing so, Jasmine leaned into the one strategy she knew always worked: consistency. She knew that if she let the noise define her, they'd write her into the narrative they wanted. But if she stayed steady, focused on the work, they'd have to contend with her on her terms. Because what Jasmine had said wasn't just a line, it was a line in the sand. But lines only matter when people pay attention to where they're drawn, and this one had the whole country watching. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Jasmine's phone buzzed with a message she hadn't expected. Unknown. Number: "Hi, Congresswoman. This is Lena Fairburn. If you have a moment, I'd like to speak with you. Privately." Jasmine paused. Lena Fairburn wasn't just anyone. She was a retired political advisor who'd worked with 3 presidents and quietly mentored a generation of Black women in politics. She rarely made public appearances, never commented on current events, and was notoriously hard to reach. After a few seconds, Jasmine texted back, "Appreciate you reaching out. I'm free after 4. Can call then." At 4:02, Jasmine sat in her car outside a grocery store, engine running, AC humming. She dialed the number, unsure what to expect. "Congresswoman," Lena's voice came through, low and clear, with a softness that still carried authority. "Ms. Fairburn," Jasmine replied, instantly respectful. "I didn't think I'd ever hear from you." "I tend to stay quiet," Lena said, "but sometimes silence doesn't serve." Jasmine waited. She wasn't sure if she was about to be scolded or praised. "I saw the footage," Lena continued. "Saw how you handled it. You kept your tone, stood your ground, and you didn't turn it into theater. That's rare. That's seasoned." Jasmine exhaled slowly, but said nothing yet. Lena went on. "I wanted to tell you something I've never said in public. 34 years ago, I was in a room in Little Rock. A man said to me, 'You'll never be respected in Washington if you wear your hair like that.' I straightened it for the next 2 years, not because I believed him, because I needed the votes." Jasmine's hand tightened on the steering wheel. "I never forgot that man," Lena said, "but I also never forgot how quiet I felt after, how much of me I'd set aside." Jasmine replied gently, "So you saw yourself in what happened?" "I saw what I used to wish I'd done. And I'm telling you this, what you said, that wasn't for cameras. That was for every woman who's been asked to shrink." They were both quiet for a few seconds. "You don't need my approval," Lena finally added, "but you've got my respect." Jasmine swallowed a small lump in her throat. "That means a lot, really." "You don't owe people softness when they offer you judgment," Lena said, "but always speak like someone's listening who needs the courage to speak next." That line settled into Jasmine's bones. They talked for 10 more minutes about policy, stamina, and the weight of being visible in places where people don't expect you to be unshaken. Lena didn't give advice as much as she passed on wisdom, like a quiet hand on the back during a long walk. When the call ended, Jasmine didn't move for a while. She stared out at the people going in and out of the store, carts rolling, toddlers crying, keys jingling. Real life. The kind of thing that doesn't care about cable news. Later that night, she told Alicia about the conversation. Alicia nodded slowly and said, "You ever think about how long it took to get from straighten your hair to speak your truth?" Jasmine smiled. "Long enough to make it count." And it was counting. More women were reaching out, sharing stories of the quiet humiliations they'd lived through and swallowed. A school principal in San Antonio, a city councilwoman in Tulsa, a mom who'd been told her head wrap was inappropriate for a parent-teacher meeting. They weren't just praising Jasmine, they were processing. And in doing so, they were letting go of something they'd carried too long. This wasn't about a viral moment anymore. It had become something heavier, something rooted. But rooted things grow. And what had begun as a single reply was now stretching its limbs across dinner tables, boardrooms, and quiet phone calls like this one. 2 weeks later, the noise had died down, but the impact hadn't. The media had moved on to a new controversy, another press leak, another tweet. But in quieter corners of the country, Jasmine Crockett's response still lingered. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it had been rooted in something that a lot of people couldn't shake. In Baltimore, a college student named Carmen used Jasmine's quote as the opening line of her commencement speech. "When you've never had to fight for anything, it's easy to think style is louder than substance." She credited it with giving her the courage to wear the traditional kente cloth her grandmother sent from Ghana, even after her department chair had hinted it might distract from the cap and gown. In El Paso, a local radio host opened his Monday segment with a monologue about perception. For years, we've told women, especially black women, that they had to look a certain way to be heard, but maybe it's time we listened first and judged later. The clip of Jasmine's speech, just 42 seconds long, was now used in training seminars about bias in the workplace, not because it offered a solution, but because it revealed the problem so clearly. And Jasmine? She kept her focus where it had always been, her district. At a town hall in Cedar Park, she stood in front of folding chairs and paper fans, fielding questions about transportation, Medicaid, and school lunch programs. She answered each one the same way she always did, clearly, directly, and without gloss. When someone in the back brought up the gala, she just smiled and said, "Let's stay on topic. The folks here showed up for policy, not pageantry." People clapped, and not because she was throwing shade, because she was working. Later that day, as she walked to her car with Alicia, she paused before unlocking the door. "You know what still gets me?" she said. "I didn't say anything revolutionary. I just didn't pretend." Alicia replied, "That's what made it hit harder. You weren't trying to win something. You were just telling the truth out loud." And in a political world built on talking points and carefully manicured phrases, that mattered more than most people realized. Jasmine's response didn't end a debate. It started one. It forced a lot of people to confront their own assumptions about respect, identity, and what leadership looks like. Not just in press rooms, but in classrooms, hospitals, banks, PTA meetings, places where appearance still whispers judgment before a word is even spoken. She'd peeled something back, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Even Melania's camp, though never public, began to shift its tone subtly. At her next public appearance, the First Lady wore a bright blue dress designed by a Ukrainian-American woman whose work focused on blending individuality with traditional form. A quiet gesture, maybe, or maybe a small acknowledgement that image isn't just about how you look, it's about what you represent. A week later, a Republican senator appeared on a Sunday show and referenced the need for more grounded dialogue between women in power. He didn't name Jasmine or Melania, but everyone understood the subtext. Meanwhile, Jasmine's supporters began referring to the gala moment as the pause. Not because of the line itself, but because of what came after. That full-body silence in the room. The kind of silence that only follows truth. Political moments come and go. They trend, they fade. But truth? That sticks around. And what Jasmine said that night, measured, quick, composed, wasn't just a comeback. It was a mirror. One that showed the difference between being seen and being understood. In the months that followed, her quote appeared on t-shirts, posters, even as the title of a podcast. But Jasmine didn't cash in on it. She didn't build a brand. She kept working, kept showing up, kept doing what she'd always done, serve. Because the lesson was never about who she put in their place. It was about staying grounded in your own. And long after the cameras packed up, that's what people remembered. Not the noise, but the stillness that followed something true. It's easy to forget that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in one sentence, measured, clear, and perfectly timed. Jasmine Crockett reminded the country of that truth without needing to dress it up or explain it afterward. She didn't beg to be understood. She didn't follow up with a string of tweets or a PR tour. She let the moment breathe. She trusted people would feel the difference between flash and foundation. And they did. In the quiet that followed, a lot of people looked in the mirror and started asking questions they hadn't thought to ask before. Who gets to be taken seriously before they speak? Why do we associate grace with silence? Why is confidence sometimes mistaken for arrogance, especially in women who don't shrink in certain rooms? Those questions didn't start with Jasmine's one-liner, but they got louder because of it. In an era when everyone's trying to go viral, Jasmine didn't aim for attention. She aimed for truth. And somehow, that reached farther than any calculated performance ever could. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't polished for TV. But she was present. And in that presence, people saw someone who reflected not the image of what a leader should look like, but what leadership actually feels like when it's lived. There's a reason that line stuck. When you've never had to fight for anything, it's easy to think style is louder than substance. It wasn't crafted for applause. It was crafted from experience, from frustration, from years of being expected to carry credentials, patience, and elegance, just to earn a baseline of respect. In a better world, that wouldn't be necessary. But in this one, words like Jasmine's plant seeds, seeds that grow into conversations, conversations that grow into understanding, an understanding that, eventually, reshapes how we see each other. That's how change really begins, not with the loudest voice in the room, but with the one that cuts through the noise without even trying to compete. The lesson? Speak your truth, even if your voice shakes, or even better, speak it so calmly that it makes the room pause before it decides how to react. And don't mistake silence for peace. Sometimes silence is discomfort trying to hide. But other times, silence is respect. Respect for a truth that landed clean. You don't need a title to be respected. You don't need the right accent, the right dress, or the right room. You just need to stand on something that can't be shaken. That's what Jasmine did, and that's why people listened. So if you're watching this, wherever you are, whoever you are, remember, you don't have to be loud to be heard. You don't have to be liked to be right. You don't have to be famous to shift the atmosphere around you. But you do have to speak, because silence in the wrong hands can be weaponized. But in the right ones, it can be a mic drop. If this story moved you, even just a little, take a second to subscribe. Not because of the drama, but because of the truth. We tell real stories about real people who remind us what matters. And trust me, there's more where that came from.